Hi, thanks for having me here at vBrownbag. I want to talk about implementing self-service storage provisioning with VRealize Automation, infrastructure as a service, or anything as a service. My name is Cody Hosterman. I'm the technical director for virtualization at Pure Storage. And I want to talk about this from a VMware perspective, right? So regardless of what storage infrastructure you have, how to implement this using VRealize Orchestrator and VRealize Automation. So self-service storage provisioning starts in VRealize Automation with VRealize Orchestrator. VRealize Orchestrator is a self-service or a GUI-based scripting engine that allows you to build workflows to manage, manipulate, and change your storage, your switches, your VMware infrastructure. Inside of VRealize Orchestrator, you can use things like the REST API with SOAP calls, SSH, PowerShell. There's a variety of mechanisms inside of VRealize Orchestrator to manipulate, change, manage your data and your infrastructure from it. Inside of VRealize Orchestrator, you create what they call a workflow. The workflow is the basic building block inside of VRealize Orchestrator for creating storage, for creating VMs, for changing your infrastructure as well. Inside of these workflows, you can have custom objects, whether it be scripted objects or basic error handling, logic, and iterating type objects. Very similar functions that you're used to in any scripting language, PowerShell and so forth. Furthermore, these all can also create actions inside of VRealize Orchestrator. And actions are a very important part of VRealize Orchestrator to make it more powerful mechanism to take data in, change it, and manipulate the inputs and the results of your workflows themselves. Actions can be simple. Take in a couple of items, a data store, virtual machine, and return true or false. Yes, this works. Yes, this is unique. Or you can take in a variety of different actions and return, instead of just a Boolean response, maybe give me all the virtual machines in this cluster or something like that. Right? So an action is a basic building block that is often repeated, takes in an object, and returns some kind of response. When you're building VRealize Orchestrator workflows, you can design them by declaring variables. You declare certain variables that can be input by the user when they're running this workflow. Maybe it's a virtual machine, maybe it's a data store. You have to decide what do you want your users to know before they run this actual workflow. These inputs to your VRealize Orchestrator workflows are called variables, and they can be either inputs or outputs. When you declare an input is something that the customer needs to input, add, enter into VRealize Orchestrator when they're running that workflow. A data store, a name, a number, a size. Outputs are what is returned by that workflow. Is it creating a VM? Is it creating a data store? Is it creating a virtual switch? Is it adding a new volume to the array? That is what's returned to the user when that workflow is completed. There's also attributes. Attributes are variables that are not necessarily inputs or not necessarily outputs. They can be both. It's something that is sent into the workflow, is manipulated and changed. It can be updated and then returned back as an output, or it can also be taken in an input, changed, and pushed back out. Right? These can be passed between the different objects inside of VRealize Orchestrator. An important part of creating your workflows is the presentation layer. The presentation layer is what you configure and change when the user is actually running the wizard to start this workflow. Do you want to have certain fields that are mandatory? Do you want to have drop-down lists? Do you want them to force them that you can only use this syntax for a name? You can use things like regular expressions to make sure it conforms to your syntax requirements, or whether it be a virtual machine name or a data store name or so forth. You can create predefined value sets. Right? When I'm creating a new data store, do I want to make sure that they have the option for kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes, terabytes, whatnot? And so they don't have to type it in, they don't have to understand maybe the syntax. So you can force them. Here are some options you can choose when running this wizard. This is particularly important moving down the road when you're using VRealize Automation. When you provision this to your end users, they probably do not necessarily know exactly how this needs to input. They don't exactly know what they can use and what they can't. So when you assign this presentation layer to an input that is an array of values, you make it easier for them to run. Less decisions they need to make when they're pushing this workflow through. So putting in these predefined values in a VRealize Orchestrator workflow makes it much easier as you move up the stack into something like self-service and VRealize Automation. Custom validation is also an important part of VRealize Orchestrator. Right? Do you want the workflow, when it is run, to actually check that input, make sure it's right, make sure it's unique? Or do you actually want to check it when they're inputting it into the wizard to run this actual workflow? And this is where custom validation comes from. Using what they call Object Graph Navigation Language, ONGL, you can actually have individual inputs run an action that you created before to check what they entered in. Right? It's called custom validation. So let's give an example here. Expanding a VMFS volume. So I have a volume, I'm going to create the underlying SCSI volume larger, and then also grow the VMFS layer as well. So what I've created is an action that takes in a data store and a new capacity. Is this new capacity larger than the previous one? Because I want to grow it, I want to make sure the capacity entered is larger. So this way it doesn't fail in the middle of the workflow. It tells them as soon as they enter in an invalid value, this value is either correct or not. So you can create these custom actions, check it, and essentially the way that custom validation works is when an action returns text, a string, back to vRO after it's checked that value, that means there's an error. So if your action returns text, so like basically I check my data store, the capacity entered is smaller, it's going to return text saying, hey, this is not big enough, right? If it returns anything but text, that means it's good. So this is an important part of understanding how OGNL works and the custom validation. Make workflows that if it's wrong, if it's not what you want, return text, some kind of message that makes sense and explains what the problem is. If it works, just return nothing, null, or just anything besides string. So when you actually input the custom validation, you can add an action into the custom validation segment and then actually write the OGNL to run that action, right? When I'm running this action from this input field, what pieces of information do I want to send to it? So in this case, I want to send the data store that I want to increase, the capacity unit, so gig, meg, terabyte, whatnot, and then also the value, right? What number, how large do I want to make this data store? How much do I want to grow it to? And so you can build this syntax, but there's also a way of actually automatically building it. So if you click this little puzzle icon in here, it'll help you choose the action, and then it'll say, hey, what inputs do you want to send to this? These are 3 inputs this action requires. Which one of the inputs of this actual workflow do you want to send into that action? So it makes it really easy and you don't have to understand the OGNL syntax. And so then when you run the wizard, if I type in a size that's incorrect, it'll return that string, the error. Hey, 7 terabytes is not larger than 8. You need a different number. And you can see the error appears on the top. If I enter a right number, 8.00001, hey, it's bigger, maybe not much, but it's bigger. Looks good, we can move forward. So that's great, that's VRealize Orchestrator in a very small nutshell. Let's talk about VRealize Automation. So an important thing about vRO is designing your workflows for VRealize Automation. What level of object do you want that user to manipulate? Do you want them to own it from the data store level? Do you want them to own it from the underlying volume level? Do you want them to own it from the virtual machine? The objects that you want them to manipulate and own is the object you should put as an input into your vRO actions or workflows. So a couple recommendations. Leverage that presentation layer. Create translator actions. Hey, I have a volume, I have a VMFS. How do they map, right? Create an action that maps those together. That makes creating larger workflows, creating additional custom actions in vRA much easier. Use these resources. vRO API, great website that has all the API information for vCenter and a variety of other ones. Also, their Manage Object Browser is a great place to look at it to see, hey, what is the result of this SDK call going to be? It helps you build the internal JavaScript much easier. You can never have too much error handling. It's a very important part of this. And also rollback. When you're creating workflows, especially from a self-service cloud environment, have rollback. If something goes wrong, clean it up. Because if you have to do manual cleanup all the time in a cloud environment, it kind of defeats part of the purpose of automation. And so the last part of this here is moving these workflows into VRealize Automation. You can import them as direct catalog items, custom actions, or even inside of VM blueprints as well. You can define your custom resources. What resource do I want my user to own? Data stores, volume, snapshots, virtual machines. Once those have been instantiated inside of VRealize Automation, which can be imported directly from vRO, if it's an object in vRO, it can be an object in vRA that they can own. You can import that workflow. vRA understands those inputs and those outputs that you assign to that workflow. And then you can customize the input. Do I want them to only be able to provision from this array, from this cluster? You can choose drop-downs. Do I want them to choose anything? Is it hard-coded? Right, you can also do this in vRA instead of just customer presentation in vRO. You can control the result. Do I just tell them, yes, the workflow worked or it didn't? Or do I actually return the object back to them? If it's a custom resource in vRA, you can return that object back to their vRA inventory. So when they create a snapshot, they own that snapshot in vRA. And so what does owning mean? It's up to you. You can import VRealize Orchestrator workflows as custom actions for those objects that they own. So they own a snapshot, oh, they're allowed to delete it, or they're allowed to create a new data store from it, right? It's entirely up to you. These custom actions can then be assigned to a certain type, so when a certain set of users has this action provisioned it, they can run those menu items. And you can change it for different users, different types, and so forth. At the end, when you assemble all these together, the custom actions, your catalog items from VRealize Orchestrator, then you can have your self-service storage provisioning in VRealize Automation through your catalog. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.